Hi, welcome to It's Not the Same Without the Sand, a show dedicated to raising the awareness about the erosion of Sandwich's vulnerable and valuable coastline. My name is Irene Sprague-Davis. I am the president of Trustees of Sandwich Beaches and your host. Today we're going to be talking about where we get the sand to replenish our beaches. And I'm honored to have as our guest today, Mr. Jim Pierce. Jim, welcome.
Thank you.
And Jim is actually currently one of the Sandwich Selectmen and was born in Sandwich and grew up here. Actually graduated from the Wing School, which we have in common. I did as well. And I'm wondering, Jim, if you could just give us a little bit more about your background.
Well, lived in town most of my life. Graduated from Sandwich High School in 1961. Went off to college. Worked for a living for quite a while. And my family and I were always vacationing here. My mother lived here virtually all of her life. Was born here and passed away in 1998. So I kind of kept on the edge of what was going on in Sandwich most of my life.
I think you're being a little humble. I know that you actually got your PhD from Brown University, is that correct?
That's right.
And had a very long career with both MIT labs, and then actually more of your time was spent with DuPont.
Yes, DuPont, 25 years, 5 of it as a working scientist, and 20 years they used to kid me I wasn't working for a living anymore, I was just managing.
Well, I think the fact that you're a scientist is probably why we get along so well, and I think that being a scientist has really helped you, I think, in a lot in this whole issue of beach erosion, because I think you think about things in a different way. I'm wondering, since you grew up here, if you could tell me a little bit about what you've seen in the just in the coastline. I mean, your family owned a lot of the property, right, down on Spring Hill Beach, is that correct?
Yeah, my great-grandfather bought some land from a fellow named John Nye back around 1902 and actually built the road down what is now Foster Road. He was Austin Foster Sr. He built Foster Road down to the beach. And he thought he was being real sharp selling those lots of sand for $75 to the tourists who'd come down from Boston.
Wow.
Of course, those are the same lots that go for $750,000 now.
Yes.
Even with inflation, I don't think it would have gone quite that high. So I was born here. My great-grandmother was part of our household until I was 8 years old when she passed away, so she told me a lot of stories about Sandwich. She could remember the heyday of the Sandwich glass factory.
Yeah.
And how Sandwich Harbor, Sandwich Harbor was one of the reasons why the glass factory was here. And when I first started hiking down to the east end of, west end of Spring Hill Beach, there was still a lot of open water where the old harbor used to be. Somehow it got nicknamed Spooky Hole at the time.
Spooky Hole, wow.
It depended on probably about 2 acres of open water. Depending on the tide, it would be 2 feet to 10, 12 feet of water. Good swimming, stayed warm because it wasn't out in the bay. It wasn't getting replenished by the cold currents all the time.
So this was an inlet that came off of the main creek? Yeah,
there's Barbara Gill can show you a map of what Sandwich Harbor looked like in 1860. And it didn't really look a lot different in 1960 than it did in 1860. There was still open water where the old Harbor Creek used to be. The creek that's there now is Musett Creek, and Old Harbor Creek has disappeared completely.
So filled in?
Yeah, either the dunes. When I first started going down there was a dune that extended from about where the last cottage is now, almost a straight line to where the inlet was confined between the two concrete piers that are still there, but the inlet isn't between them anymore.
Okay.
And it was a little bit concave, but it was nearly a straight line along there. Now it's all been scooped out, and if you go down there, the inlet is probably 10 times as wide as it was in 1960.
Yep, I remember that.
Yeah. So the key, if you My great-grandmother was around before there was a Cape Cod Canal. And when it was first dug in 1914, it was about less than half the width that it is now. When they widened it in the early 30s and then extended Scusset Pier out, that's when the flow of sand became seriously interrupted. And but even then, by the late 50s and early 60s, when I can remember, there wasn't a lot of change, not a lot of filling or widening of the inlet. It was when the Corps decided, for good reason, to extend the breakwater out to its current length.
So let's talk about that. The reason they extended it is because there was too much sand getting in the canal. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. The sand was the natural flow of sand is from the White Cliffs up in Plymouth. My sister had her wedding reception at White Cliffs in, let's see, probably 1966, and the building where she had the wedding reception had to be moved back because the cliff has receded some 30 feet even since that time period. So the source of sand is the White Cliffs you can see across the bay over in Plymouth.
What I find is amazing is that has receded 30 feet. The Sandwich Beach has also eroded back at least 23 feet because they had to move the steps back. It's been probably significantly more than that. So where's all that sand going?
I'm assured by the Woods Hole Group, who the town has had on the payroll for a decade or so, doing various studies for us and working on permits, that there's a huge heap of sand out off the end of the canal channel. Before I'm not an expert on this one now, but I'm just repeating what I hear from others. Before the breakwater was extended, the sand was piling up over at Scusset Beach. And you'll hear people sometimes now complain about how far they have to hike from the parking lot to get to the water.
Yeah, we wish we had that problem.
So sand was accumulating there. You look at an aerial photograph and you can clearly see that the coastline has been altered and there's a huge pileup of sand behind the breakwater. But when the breakwater was extended, what I'm told is that the current couldn't move in there. The back pressure couldn't get into that little jog behind the breakwater. So the current changed course, and now it moves across the canal channel out off the end of the breakwater. It loses energy when it gets to the other side of the canal channel, and the sediment that it's carrying dumps in an area out off the end of the canal, maybe half, 3/4 of a mile off the shore of Sandwich. So we met with Kirk Bosma from the Woods Hole Group, who assured us that there was plenty of sand to satisfy our needs deposited where that current loses energy and drops the sand. So what should be on our beach is about a half to 3/4 of a mile off our beach.
Now, there are people that believe that with that extension of the jetty that more sand is actually building up on Scusset, but from what you're saying, that's not true. That the extension of the jetty actually has reduced some of the accretion in Scusset and sent it out in the ocean.
Well, there may be both happening.
Yeah.
That's I haven't been up to Scusset since I moved back to town, except to drive once around the parking lot just to see what it looked like. So I don't know whether there's still sand, whether the shoreline is still growing in Scusset or not. It wouldn't surprise me if it was. But the main alteration is my brother-in-law has been a diver for years, and he used to dive on wrecks out off there, and he says that some of them you can't find anymore.
Yeah.
So
they're buried.
Yeah, buried in that sand that
Wow.
should be on our beach. And it's the right kind of sand, too. That's one of the things that is not fully understood, I think, is that sand isn't just sand. There's lots of kind. If it's too fine, it liquefies too fast. Geologists will talk about subsidence angles and things of
So there's actually a science of sand.
Yes, there is. And sand, if you saturate it with water, will turn into quote-unquote quicksand, and it just moves like a liquid. And if you put sand that's too fine, or sand that's too coarse, or sand that's not the right mixture of fine and coarse on the beach, then it may just disappear like the last load that we put on there in 1993 or 97 or whenever it was.
Of course, that was the right sand. I mean, that was the sand dredged from the canal, correct?
Probably. Yeah. If it was dredged from the mouth of the canal, which is inwash
Right.
from that shoal that's off the end of the canal, then it was the right kind of sand. If it was sand dredged from any place, say further up than the Sagamore Bridge, it probably may not have been the right kind of, not have been the right kind of sand.
But it was my understanding in talking with Kirk Bosma, who we will hopefully have on the show later, that the reason that that sand didn't stay was really because it was not placed underneath the high water mark. And so it was a pile of sand, and they didn't have the permits. They had to get permits very quickly in order to be able to capture that sand from Morant, who was dredging. And therefore, because it wasn't graded and went into the under the water line, because they couldn't get the permits because of lobsters, et cetera, that's the reason it didn't stay. They didn't expect it to stay.
Yeah, that is what Kirk has said consistently.
Yeah.
And yeah, again, if I understood what he was saying, the reason for grading it out beyond the water line is that you want the waves to break before they get to the dune.
That's right.
Not
at
the
them.
foot of the dune.
Right.
So they didn't get the permits to put it far enough out. They didn't have enough of it to put it that far out, even if they wanted to.
They did, yeah.
So that's another thing that we have to keep in mind, is that when the canal is dredged periodically, it may produce 50,000 cubic yards, maybe up to 100,000 cubic yards of sand. To do the job, we need somewhere between 250,000 and 500,000 cubic yards of sand.
250,000 to 500,000 cubic yards. That's a lot of sand. Now, do we have that sand out in that deposit in the ocean?
That's what Kirk said that meeting we had at Town Hall, is that there's more than enough sand in that deposit to satisfy whatever Sandwich may need and to deal. It's not just a Sandwich problem, by the way.
That's right.
It's any town that has a north-facing coast on Cape Cod Bay, so it includes Sandwich and Barnstable, Yarmouth, Dennis, Brewster, maybe even Orleans, that have the natural flow of sand goes right along that coast. And when we used to go down to Sandy Neck to dig sea clams, I went down at clam tide last November, and there's nothing like the amount of area of sand flats down there that there was.
Those sand flats were extensive. I remember that as a child. Yeah.
And the sand flats out in front of my grandmother had a cottage at 75 Salt Marsh Road. There was always you didn't need an extreme low tide to get a sandbar for us kids to play on in the 50s. And there were sandbars down probably as far as, I can't really recall but maybe several hundred yards further west along the beach, there was sand flats that came out at a normal low tide. You didn't have, now if you get a low tide that's a foot and a half below mean, you get a sand flat off 75 Salt Marsh. In the 50s, half the month when the tide was, anytime you had something that went down to mean low, you had a sand flat there.
I'd like to talk about some of the work that you've done with the Cape Cod Commission, and they convened a committee, was it the Ocean Management Planning Committee, am I correct?
Yeah, the Massachusetts Ocean Management Plan ceded to Barnstable County the rights to come up with a Cape Cod Ocean Management Plan that would handle the state waters, so from 1,500 feet below mean low to 3 miles off, and then of course they draw lines across Cape Cod Bay so that the state maintains the jurisdiction over most of Cape Cod Bay. And the major portion of that ocean management plan had to deal with wind and siting of wind turbines. I'd say 90–95% of the conversation that we had in a group made up of one selectman from each of the 15 towns was about wind turbines, and the other 5% was divided between cables and sand and gravel mining. When the regulations that the committee approved went before the Chamber of Delegates, the pro-wind and anti-wind elephants wrestled and trampled the sand and gravel mining interest into the ground, and the whole package failed.
So from what I understand, from what you've told me, is that you were hoping to be able to protect that sand so that it would only be able to be used to replenish the beach. Is that correct? Mm-hmm. Something along those lines?
Yeah, the state ocean management plan has wording in it that the sand could only be used for beach nourishment. And the proposed regulations that the committee came up with said that it could only be used for beach nourishment and only within Barnstable County. So there was, we wanted it, it's
so that would have been good for us.
It's there for us to use. The key is we need to have that sand deposit pre-permitted. So we need to keep the attention of the county and the state on issuing some form of blanket permit that would allow towns like Sandwich to draw on that sand resource to periodically nourish our beaches. It's not a strange concept either. It's states in New Jersey, Delaware, North Carolina all have similar legislation, and I've heard but not seen that in New Jersey they periodically liquefy the sand and pump it up on the beach from a mile or two offshore.
Sure.
So, one thing we have to keep on top of is that there are three key ingredients to dealing with the beach nourishment problem. There's permits, there's sand, and there's money. In my opinion, the sand is going to be the rate limiting step in this. We could have the permits, we could have the money, and we'd just be all dressed up with no place to go if we don't have a source of sand and the right kind of sand to do the job that needs doing. So.
But we do. I mean, we've got a pile of sand out there in the ocean that could completely replenish the beach and help with the realignment of the inlet as well, from what I understand.
Yeah.
So it's there. The question is whether we can get at it, I think is what you're saying.
That's right. Now, we went back. This is the 15 Selectmen Committee on the regulations for the Cape Cod Ocean Management Plan. We met maybe a month ago, and revisited just the sand and gravel mining element of the Ocean Management Plan. I don't know when the plan is to resubmit these regulations to the Chamber of Delegates, but we need to lobby our representatives on that committee to try and move that ahead. And we probably need to, I know that our state rep, Randy Hunt, and our state senator, Teresa Murray, are firmly behind this effort.
So it sounds like what we're trying to get then is the regulations that you were trying to propose before, that we would actually protect the sand and it would be used for beach nourishment only. Is that correct?
Yes, not just protect it, but we need an active permit that says we can draw that, we can take sand from that deposit.
When we need it.
When we need it.
Yes.
And there's an unfortunate term that they use, they call it a borrow pit, which gives you the impression we're going to dig a big hole in the bottom of the ocean and just leave it sit there. What we're doing is taking sand that wouldn't be there, the same sand that would be on Sandwich beaches and on the Sandy Neck sandbars. We're trying to correct a problem that human intervention caused in the first place.
That's right.
That sand is deposited out there. It disturbed whatever marine habitat was there 100 years ago or 50 years ago.
Yeah, it's unnatural. It's not where it naturally was meant to go.
Yeah, and it's a sand shoal. It's a sand mountain. It's not. You're not going to dig a hole in the bottom of the ocean. We're going to just remove sand that was deposited there as a result of the change in currents that was caused by the change in the breakwater, which was again caused by the need to have the Cape Cod Canal.
So that's one source of sand, and that seems to be the largest and the most likely source of sand for us. But there is certainly the sand in Scusset, which Scusset is that part of Scusset is part of Sandwich, from what I understand. Is that a possible source of sand over there, where all that sand is built up?
Certainly, in my mind, it's a possible source of sand. And yes, it's territorially within the town of Sandwich, but it's state-owned.
Yeah.
So we also have a problem, if you want to call it a problem. We need to deal with the need to permit removal of sand from that source as well. Now, clearly, anybody looking at an aerial photograph will tell you that sand is where it is because of human intervention when the canal was widened back in 1932 or 33. So we should be able to, there are all kinds of dredges. I'm not qualified to comment on what kind we have, what kind we should have, but there's something that's called a hopper dredge, I think, where you could go over and help. We could move the shoreline back and help those folks that don't like to hike all the way to the beach, and
It's a win-win.
suck it into the hopper and move around and pump it back onto the beach in Sandwich, and the natural actions of the bay will continue to move it on down toward Barnstable and Dennis and Yarmouth, etc. But until we can get it around the end of the canal in some way or another, we will continue to see the inlet in Sandwich widening, and instead of the marsh filling up over the grass twice a month, it's virtually 7-8 days a month now, I guess, that we get tides that completely submerge the grass.
Yes, agreed. So we talked about Scusset. We've talked about that sand mound that's out in the ocean. We also have a source, which is the canal. And from what I understand, there's just not enough sand in the canal to really replenish the beaches. I mean, maybe they can help with maintenance, but not replenishment. Is that your understanding?
That's right. They only dredge it when they need to. So we could be there with the permits and be there with some money, but if they're not ready to dredge, then the permits run out, or the appropriation has a shelf life of where we're getting the money.
Yep.
And there just isn't enough of it.
So there's one other source that people have discussed, and that is all the sand that has come from the barrier beach and gone into the creek. I mean, I've done some kayaking, and if you look at the bottom of that creek, it is just filled with sand. So some people have talked about the idea of using the county dredge. And some of the people may not realize that Sandwich contributes, is that correct, towards this county dredge that we could utilize to try to get some of that sand back up on the beach. Is there any discussion among the selectmen regarding that?
Mark Galkowski, our natural resources director, has been an advocate of that, and is working with the county dredge people and keeps the selectmen informed of whatever progress he's making. And that would be, in my mind anyway, a great stopgap. You could do a little bit of beach management with the 10, 20,000 cubic yards you might get out of that source. There's always the permitting problem.
Yes.
Permitting has become a cottage industry for keeping consultants and the like gainfully employed. So we have to make sure we get our ducks in a row from a permitting perspective. There'd probably be an additional permit for disturbing the creek bed.
That's right.
As opposed, in addition to the permit for putting it on land side when you take it out of the creek.
So you're absolutely right in terms of the three-step process. We have to have the permits, and the town voted to appropriate $150,000 from the Community Preservation Act, and is that right?
That's right.
So we're in the process of getting the permits, and we also need to have the sand, the money. The next is the money, and then the sand. Do you know, in terms of looking at the different sites that we talked about, there's the canal, there's Scusset, there's the creek, there's the sand mound out in the ocean. Of those, which one would be most cost effective? I know where we'll get the most sand, but is one a lot more expensive?
Excuse me. I'm really not qualified to talk about that at all. I have no idea which. I do know that pumping sand from an underwater borrow pit to the shoreline is practiced in at least 3 other states.
Yes.
So it can't be cost prohibitive if that's what's happening. I don't know what the relative cost of loading sand from Scusset onto a barge and bringing it around the end of the canal and then pumping it onto the beach would be, or that's got to be comparable with dredging sand up off the bottom of the canal, bringing it out of the canal and putting it on the beach. None of those, the latter of those is not cost prohibitive.
Yep.
Since it's happened before. We've got an existence proof that we can do that. So, and the county dredge is another. We know it can be done.
Yes.
So they're all, they've all been done in the past, so they can't be monstrously costly. And which is more cost effective than the other, I have not a clue.
Yeah. Well, certainly, I think getting the permits, of course, is the first step. We've identified where the sand is. We are going to have to get the money, or we have to find the source of money. So it's a big problem, and from what I understand, we're working on all 3 fronts in parallel, which I think is really important.
Yeah, that the words "in parallel" are essential there. We can't do this sequentially.
Right.
We get the permits first. By the time we get the source of sand, some of the permits have shelf life. They run out.
That's right.
So we have to get the permits, the sand, and the money all have to come together at the same time.
And we've been blessed this year with at least, knock on wood, a mild winter.
So far, so good.
So far, so good. So hopefully we can at least get through this winter. I think we're going to have to get through at least another winter, and I'm nervous about that.
Yeah, well, the the last storm of the century was November 27th, 1898. So we're kind of overdue. That was that was the Portland gale, and named because the steamship Portland went down with all hands and passengers in that storm. And there's another thing to keep in mind is it's not the fast-traveling hurricane that's going to do us in.
No, it's the one that sits.
It's the 3 or 4 day nor'easter that just sits out there circulating counterclockwise and throwing water into the bay for 3 or 4 days. That's going to end up with Brady's Island underwater and Flotsam and Jetsam on River Street.
Yeah. Well, that's all we have time for today, so I want to thank you for all the work that you've done on this issue, and I want to wish you the best in your re-election.
Well, thank you.
And
I didn't know this was a campaign stop.
No. But I do appreciate all that you've done for the area or the issue of beach erosion, and keep up the good work. Thank you very much.
Thank you.